There's a kind of silence that only exists in war. Not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a library, or even the silence of a graveyard on a Sunday morning. Those silences are soft things. Comfortable. The kind you can wrap yourself in and sleep. This silence is different. This silence has teeth. It is the silence of 12 men crouched in the dark, radios dead, GPS scrambled, deep inside enemy territory with no extraction window, and no word from the one person who was supposed to lead them home. It is the silence of men who have jumped out of planes in the black of night, who have swum through freezing ocean water with knives in their teeth, who have done things that will never appear in any newspaper, and who are, for the first time in a long time, afraid. Not afraid of dying. SEALs make their peace with dying somewhere around week 2 of training. They are afraid of something far worse. They are afraid their captain is already dead. For 72 hours, Captain Marcus Webb had been missing. Not missing the way a civilian goes missing. No search parties, no flyers, no tearful press conferences. Missing the way special operations soldiers go missing in denied access zones, which is to say, swallowed whole by a country that officially didn't know they were there, doing a mission that officially never happened, in service of a government that would officially deny everything if it came to that. 72 hours. His team had run every contingency. They had checked the rally points. They had risked exposure 3 separate times, pushing into sectors they had been ordered to stay out of. Nothing. Not a signal. Not a body. Not a boot print in the mud pointing anywhere useful. And then, at 0400 on the 4th morning, a vehicle came down the mountain road. The men raised their weapons. Fingers moved to triggers. 14 years of combined combat experience pointed itself at a single pair of headlights cutting through the dark. The vehicle stopped 40 meters out. A door opened. Someone stepped into the headlight glow. The figure was lean and unhurried, moving with the kind of stillness that only comes from years of learning how to disappear in a landscape. A rifle hung across the back, not slung carelessly, but positioned with the deliberateness of someone who had long ago stopped thinking about it as a weapon and started thinking about it as a part of the body. One of the SEALs, a staff sergeant named Dylan who had 2 tours in Fallujah and 1 in Mosul, lowered his weapon first. Not because he recognized the figure, because the figure was walking directly toward 14 armed men in the dark without slowing down, without raising hands, without flinching, and whatever that was, it was not the walk of an enemy. It was the walk of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. Behind the figure, half supported and half walking on his own, was Captain Marcus Webb. Alive, dehydrated. 2 cracked ribs, from what the medic would later determine, was a fall of at least 15 feet. A shallow knife wound along his left forearm that had been field-dressed with something that smelled like motor oil and tree bark. But alive. The figure stopped 6 feet from Dylan. Pull back a hood. The face underneath was a woman's face. Sharp-boned, unreadable, the kind of calm that isn't coldness, but something beyond it, a stillness that has been earned through the specific curriculum of surviving things most people don't. She said nothing. She looked at the assembled team the way a person looks at a problem they have already solved, just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Then, she turned around and walked back to her vehicle. Nobody stopped her. Nobody knew what to say. Marcus Webb watched her go with an expression that none of his men had ever seen on his face before. Not after Amadi, not after the Karengal, not after the night outside Kunduz when they lost 2 good men and got the mission done anyway. It was the expression of a man who has been forced to revise something fundamental about what he thought he knew. He watched her taillights disappear into the mountain dark. Then, he looked at his team. Debrief in 20, he said. And nobody asks me anything until I've had water. This is the story of how Captain Marcus Webb got lost, how he was found, and how the woman who found him had been building toward that moment for the better part of a decade. In rifle ranges, in conflict zones, in rooms full of men who told her she didn't belong, in the quiet and merciless discipline of becoming the kind of person who walks toward 14 armed men in the dark and doesn't break her stride. Her name was Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez. And this is where it starts. Elena Vasquez learned to shoot in a cornfield in central Texas when she was 9 years old. Her grandfather, a quiet man with hands like old leather and the particular kind of patience that only comes from spending decades farming land that doesn't want to cooperate, set up tin cans on a fence post and handed her a .22 rifle and said nothing. He didn't explain the mechanics, didn't walk her through the breathing, didn't talk about sight alignment or trigger discipline or any of the vocabulary that would come later in other places with other people who would be far less gentle about it. He just handed her the rifle and stepped back. She missed the first can, missed the second, hit the third one dead center without fully understanding why, only feeling something settle in a place inside her chest, a quieting like a door swinging shut on a room full of noise. And her grandfather, who was not a man who wasted words, said again, she shot until her shoulder ached, shot until the fence post was empty and they had to reset, shot until the light went out of the sky, and her grandmother called them in for dinner, and her grandfather put the rifle away in the cabinet in the hallway and locked it without ceremony, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Elena would think about that afternoon for the rest of her life. Not because it was the first time she fired a weapon, but because it was the first time she felt the world make sense to her in a way it usually didn't. At school, the noise of other children exhausted her. At home, the television exhausted her. Even the church they went to on Sundays, with its singing and its warmth and its genuine human goodness, exhausted her in a way she couldn't explain and spent years feeling guilty about. She loved people. She just loved them better from a distance. At a distance, she could see them clearly. This, she would later understand, was not a deficiency. It was the central fact of who she was, and everything she would become was built around it. She grew up in a town where girls were expected to get married somewhere between 18 and 22 to men they had known since middle school, in ceremonies at the same church their parents had married in. This was not presented as a limitation. It was presented as a destination, which is a different and more suffocating thing, because destinations imply that movement has stopped and the journey is over. Elena's journey had barely started. She was 17 when she found the Army recruiter's brochure in the waiting room of the county health clinic, where she had gone to get a form signed for a school athletic physical. The brochure was not glamorous. It was a cheap printed thing, slightly water damaged at one corner, the kind of collateral that ends up in waiting rooms because nobody thought about it hard enough. But there was a photograph on the front, a woman in uniform standing in a field, rifle at her shoulder, eye to the scope, and Elena stood in that waiting room for 5 minutes with the form still and signed in her hand, looking at that photograph. She took the brochure. She didn't tell her mother, didn't tell anyone. She studied it the way other girls studied fashion magazines, with the same hunger and the same private certainty that this thing she was looking at was the version of the world she was supposed to be living in. She enlisted at 18. Her mother cried. Her father, who had served one tour in the Gulf and come back with a titanium knee replacement and a distaste for discussing it, said only, train harder than anyone tells you to, and then train harder than that. She trained. Basic was no revelation. It was confirmation. Every morning run, every obstacle, every screaming instructor who got in her face to see if she would fold. None of it surprised her. She had been preparing for it in a wordless and instinctive way that certain people prepare for the life they are meant for, since she was 9 years old on a fence post in Central Texas. What surprised her was the shooting. Not because she was good at it. She had always known she was good at it. What surprised her was how good, and what that goodness meant in the context of an institution that had very specific ideas about what women were for. Her scores at qualification were not simply high. They were anomalous. The kind of scores that make instructors recheck their clipboards and then look at the shooter again, as if the discrepancy between what they expected and what they measured must be the fault of the measurement. She shot a 240 out of 240 on the standard qualification course, 3 times in a row. The 4th time, for no reason she could articulate except boredom, she put every round within a dime-sized group at the center of the target. The instructor, a staff sergeant named Pruitt, who had 20 years in and a jaw like a cinder block, looked at the target, looked at her, looked at the target again. Vasquez, he said. Sergeant, do that again. She did. He walked away without speaking. Came back 20 minutes later with 2 other men she didn't recognize, both in the kind of nondescript civilian clothes that military people wear when they're trying to look like they are not military people and are not succeeding. They watched her shoot. They didn't say anything to her that day. But 3 weeks later, she received orders she hadn't applied for to a training program at Fort Bragg that wasn't listed in any of the pamphlets she had been given at enlistment. She packed her bag and went. The program was 8 months long and involved, among other things, instruction in long-range precision shooting across distances she had previously considered theoretical, fieldcraft that went so far beyond camouflage and concealment as to constitute a separate philosophical discipline, advanced mathematics that she taught herself in the evenings because she was the only one in her cohort who hadn't been pre-selected with a college degree, and a series of psychological evaluations she was never shown the results of. She was the only woman in the program. She registered this fact the first morning during the initial formation, when she stood in a line of 32 people and looked down that line and understood that she was the only one who would be looked at differently, spoken to differently, evaluated differently, and would have to produce results that were not merely equal to her peers, but measurably superior in order to be considered roughly equivalent. She had known this going in. She was from Texas. She was not naive about the architecture of the world she was entering. She found, to her own faint surprise, that she did not mind. She had always been someone who operated best under conditions of documented unfairness, because it stripped away ambiguity. When the rules were clearly stacked against you, the only question that remained was whether you were going to let them stack or not. And Elena Vasquez had never been built for letting things stack against her. She graduated in the top 3 of her cohort. Not top 3 among the women. Top 3 overall. The 2 men ahead of her, a rangy Georgian named Harris and a former college wrestler from Minnesota named Kowalski, both shook her hand after the graduation formation, with the slightly dazed respect of people who had come to see a competition and found themselves outcompete by someone they hadn't been watching closely enough. She went overseas for the first time 6 months later. Not to a combat zone, officially, to a country that the United States government was officially not conducting operations in, to do work that officially wasn't happening, in support of objectives that officially didn't exist. She understood by this point how much of the world ran unofficially. Her first confirmed long-range engagement was at 1,240 meters in a country she was not in, targeting a man whose name she had been given on a laminated card along with her photographs and 3 biographical paragraphs that told her everything she needed to know and nothing she needed to feel. The conditions were difficult, a crosswind shifting between 8 and 12 knots, a temperature differential between the muzzle and the target that required a correction she calculated in her head because she had been doing it in her head since Fort Bragg, and she trusted her head more than she trusted equipment that could fail. She made the shot on the first trigger pull. She did not feel proud. She did not feel remorseful. She felt the quiet click of a door swinging shut on a room full of noise, the same sensation she had felt on a fence post in Texas at age 9, and she understood that this was simply who she was and what she was for, and the only honest thing to do was to be it as precisely as possible. She went back to her position. She packed her equipment with the systematic care she brought to everything. She filed the report in the format required and used the language required and noted the wind correction and the distance and the outcome and left no room in the document for the fact that she had done it with a crosswind shifting 8 to 12 knots without a spotter, which was not standard, not recommended, and not something most people at her line of work would have attempted. She had not thought of it as an attempt. She had thought of it as a task. This was the distinction that made Elena Vasquez different from a great many skilled people, and more dangerous than almost all of them. She did not experience difficulty as an elevated state. She experienced it as the baseline. Easy things were simply things that hadn't revealed their difficulty yet. Over the following 4 years, she ran operations in 7 countries, accumulated a record that people in certain buildings in Washington, D.C. discussed in tones of reluctant admiration, and built a reputation that spread through the specific small world of special operations the way all genuine reputations spread in that world. Not through official channels, not through press releases, but through the word of people who had been in the field with her or adjacent to her, and had come home with a recalibrated understanding of what was possible. She was known, in the shorthand of that world, as someone you called when the problem was real, not when it was difficult. Difficult was subjective, and the people in this world were not interested in subjective. When the problem was real, when other solutions had been tried and the math had come up wrong, when the window was narrow and the consequence of missing the window was the kind of thing nobody in the debrief room was willing to say out loud. She did not cultivate this reputation. She was largely indifferent to it. Reputation was a thing other people built around you, and what other people built was not really your business. Your business was the work, the preparation, the shot, the pack-up, the report. She had been doing this for 6 years by the time the call came through that sent her toward a mountain road in a country she was not officially in, in search of a SEAL captain who was not officially missing in a mission that was not officially happening. She'd been on leave. Actual leave, sitting in her grandfather's house in Central Texas, doing nothing in particular, drinking coffee on the porch in the mornings, and watching the light come up over the fields with the unhurried attention of someone who understands that unhurried mornings are not common and should be used fully when they come. Her phone rang at 0630. She looked at the number, put down her coffee, answered. The voice on the other end gave her the coordinates, the timeline, the last known position, the communication blackout details. It gave her the name, Captain Marcus Webb, Naval Special Warfare, missing 72 hours for previous rescue attempt called off due to threat conditions. Then, it gave her the assets available to her. One vehicle, her own rifle, whatever she brought in her kit. No team, no air support, no extraction window defined, no official authorization because officially nobody was there. She said, understood. She hung up, finished her coffee, went inside, and told her grandfather she had to go somewhere for a few days. He looked at her over his glasses the way he had looked at her since she was 9 years old, with the quiet certainty of a man who had always understood exactly what kind of person his granddaughter was and had never once tried to change it. Come back, he said. Yes, sir, she said. She drove to the airfield with a bag she had packed in 11 minutes, boarded a flight that didn't show up on commercial tracking, and fell asleep somewhere over the Atlantic with the total and untroubled ease of someone whose conscience is clear and whose preparation is complete. She did not spend the flight thinking about the mission. She had already thought about it. Thinking about it again would be redundant. She slept until they began their descent, then woke, drank water, ate the meal she had packed herself because she had stopped trusting institutional food somewhere around her second deployment, and reviewed the coordinates one final time. Then she put the file away. What happened next? The 2 days she spent moving through contested terrain in conditions that made the assigned analyst back in whatever building was running the background logistics right terse, and impressive words in their incident logs was not magic and was not heroism and was not any of the other words that would later be attached to it by people who weren't there. It was preparation meeting a specific problem in a specific place, applied with the patience of someone who had spent her entire life learning how to see clearly from a distance. She found Marcus Webb on the second day, in a drainage channel 3 kilometers from the last known position, in a condition that was bad but survivable, with a core temperature that was concerning and a morale that was characteristically for a SEAL officer, doing significantly better than the body supporting it. She gave him water, gave him the field ration she had brought extra of, dressed the wound on his arm with actual supplies from her kit, rather than whatever the terrain had provided him in her absence. He looked at her for a long time. Vasquez, he said. He had been given her name, or had worked it out, or had simply been in the community long enough to know the list of people who got called when the problem was real. Sir, she said, how many of you are there? She looked at him steadily. One, she said. He absorbed this. All right, he said. They moved at night. She set the pace, slower than he wanted, faster than his body was asking for. Calibrated to a calculation, she was running continuously about time, terrain, his physiological state, and the threat pattern she had mapped over the previous 48 hours. He did not argue with her pace. He was, she noted, a man who understood the difference between pride and survival, and had learned to set the first one down when the second one required it. This was rarer than it should have been. They reached the vehicle at 0345. She loaded him in, drove the mountain road to the rally point coordinate with the lights off of the first 3 kilometers, navigating by the terrain features she had memorized, not by instinct, but by the same deliberate preparation that underpinned everything she did. When they came over the last rise, and the headlights of her vehicle cut through the dark toward the rally point, she could see the shapes of men in positions that told her everything about their training and their state of readiness. Weapons up. Disciplined. No noise. She stopped the vehicle, got out, walked toward them, did not raise her hands. She had thought about this, the optics of arrival, the way the team would be reading her approach, the precise combination of body language that communicated, I am not a threat, without communicating, I am someone who needs to convince you I am not a threat, which were very different things. She walked like a person who had already solved the problem, because she had. One of the men lowered his weapon, then another, then the rest, following the social proof of whoever had moved first, with a herd instinct that lives inside even the most trained human beings. She stopped 6 feet out, looked at them. There were things she could have said, things that, in other circumstances, she might have said, a briefing, a debrief, an acknowledgement of the situation and the outcome. She said none of them. She turned around, walked back to her vehicle, got in, and drove back down the mountain road. Behind her, in the dark, 12 men with 14 years of combined combat experience stood in silence and watched her taillights disappear. And Captain Marcus Webb, standing among them with cracked ribs and a field-dress knife wound, and the expression of a man whose fundamental categories have just been reorganized by events, said nothing for a long time. Then he said debrief in 20. And then, very quietly, more to himself than to anyone, she didn't even look back. Nobody replied, because there wasn't really anything to say to that. She was already gone. The debrief happened in a concrete room with no windows and one fluorescent light that buzzed on a frequency that would have driven a less disciplined person out of their mind. The table was metal. The chairs were metal. Everything in the room was designed by someone who had decided, at some structural level, that comfort was the enemy of accuracy, and Marcus Webb had sat in enough rooms like it to barely notice anymore. His team was on one side of the table. An intelligence liaison named Pryor, who had the pale, slightly rumpled look of a man who lived predominantly in rooms like this one, was on the other side, next to a woman from the State Department whose name Marcus had not been given and who did not offer it. They went through it systematically. The ambush, the separation, the communications failure, the 72-hour window, the conditions in the field. Marcus answered everything directly and without embellishment because this was what the debrief required, and because he was 38 years old and had been through enough of these to know that the only way out was through, and the only thing worse than a bad debrief was a dishonest one. When they got to the question of his recovery, specifically of the asset who had located and extracted him, Pryor slid a photograph across the table. Marcus looked at it. Yes, he said. You recognized her at the time? By name. I'd heard the name. Never worked directly with anyone from her unit. And her approach, the method of extraction, was consistent with the briefing you received prior to the operation? Marcus looked at Pryor. I didn't receive a briefing, he said, about any recovery asset. A brief silence. You weren't told? I was told to get to the rally point if I became separated. I was not told there would be a one-person recovery element operating in the area. He paused. I was not told it was Vasquez. Pryor made a note. The authorization chain on that asset deployment was compressed, given the timeline. Compressed, Marcus said. There were administrative considerations. She went in alone, Marcus said, into that terrain, with the threat level that area was running at the time. He said it flatly. He was not making an accusation. He was making a record. Nobody told me she was coming. Nobody, as far as I can tell, told her team she was going. Who authorized the deployment? Pryor looked at the woman from the State Department. The woman from the State Department looked at nothing in particular with an expression that had been professionally trained to communicate absolutely nothing. The authorization is above the classification level of this debrief, she said. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Understood, he said. He understood perfectly. The authorization probably didn't exist on paper in any form that would survive scrutiny. Vasquez had been called by someone who trusted her and trusted the problem, and the paperwork had been designed to follow the outcome rather than precede it. If the outcome had been different, if she hadn't come back or had come back without him, there would have been a different set of documents filed and a different set of words used, all of them technically accurate and none of them capturing anything that had actually happened. This was how the world ran. He had made his peace with it years ago. He was making it again now, in the fluorescent buzz of a concrete room, with the specific texture of frustration that comes not from the deception itself, but from the continued pretense that the deception is invisible to the people it is practiced on. He signed what they needed him to sign. He shook hands with Pryor, who had not done anything wrong except exist in a system that required him to manage information in the way he managed it. He did not shake hands with the woman from the State Department. She did not offer one. He walked out into a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and reconstituted coffee, and his team was waiting for him with the slightly unnatural stillness of men who had been debriefed first and had been sitting here long enough to want answers he wasn't immediately going to give them. Webb, said Dylan. Walk with me, Marcus said. They walked to the far end of the hallway, out of the range of the camera mounted above the debrief room door, and Marcus stopped and turned and looked at his team and said, any questions about the operation itself, the ambush, the separation, those get answered in the official debrief document, which you'll have access to in 48 hours. Anything else, ask. Dylan, who was the most senior and who tended to be the one who said the things the others were calculating whether to say, the woman. Vasquez. Yeah, who is she? Marcus thought about how to answer this. Not because he didn't know. He had spent 2 days in a drainage channel and on a mountain road with her, had watched her make decisions the way a chess player watches another chess player recognize a pattern, with the particular quality of attention that is not admiration exactly, but is something adjacent to it, something more unsettled. He knew who she was. What he was calculating was the difference between what he knew and what was useful to transmit in a hallway outside a debrief room. She's a Sergeant First Class Army. Precision fires background. She's been running solo recovery and target operations for approximately 4 years. She's very good. He paused. That's not sufficient, actually. She's the best I've encountered at what she does. Dylan absorbed this. She did that job alone. Yes. Into that area. Yes. Another pause. Without authorization, per what we were told. Per what we were told, Marcus agreed, with precisely the inflection that indicated he was noting the qualification rather than endorsing the characterization. His team understood this. They were not naive people. All right, Dylan said. That was all. They want to get food and sleep in that order because those were the two things the body requires after sustained operational stress, and the body's requirements at a certain point in a career stop being things you argue with. Marcus ate, slept 4 hours, woke at 0500 with the particular clarity of someone whose nervous system has processed the acute phase and moved on to the accounting. He put in a request through channels he had been carefully building for 11 years to find out everything that was findable about Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez. It took 3 days to come back. He read it in the same concrete room, with the same fluorescent buzz with prior not present, and the woman from state nowhere in evidence, just Marcus and a folder and the specific quality of silence that accumulates in rooms where significant information has been delivered and is being absorbed. The file was long. More accurately, the file was the thin edge of something much larger that he wasn't cleared for, and what was visible was still, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. 7 countries, 4 years of solo operations, a list of confirmed engagements that had been partially redacted but was still, in its redacted form, the kind of list that makes a person revise their understanding of what a human being operating in a particular direction can accomplish in 4 years if the human being is Elena Vasquez. One detail stopped him. There was a notation in the file, a single line from approximately 18 months prior, that read, Asset declined reassignment to team-based unit, 4th occasion. Reason given, operational preference for solo deployment. For times offered team, for times declined. He sat with this for a while. There was a version of that which was straightforward. Some people worked better alone. This was a real phenomenon. The field had its solitary practitioners the way the academic world had its solitary researchers, and the best ones were sometimes made better, not worse, by the absence of coordination overhead. But 4 times. 4 times someone had looked at her file and decided she was too good to leave in solo configuration, and 4 times she had said no. Politely, presumably. On the record, absolutely. With reasons that were noted as operational preference, which was the bureaucratic vessel into which the system poured everything it didn't have a better category for. He closed the file. Thought about the way she had walked toward his team in the dark. Not toward him, toward the armed men who didn't know her, who had weapons up, who had no reason yet to trust the figure coming out of the dark. She had walked toward them specifically, not with her hands raised, not with any of the compliance signaling that the situation might have called for, but with the assurance of someone who had already run the calculation and knew how it came out. She had known they would stand down. She had known because she understood at some level that was below reasoning and above instinct exactly how human beings process the specific combination of physical stillness, directional confidence, and unhurried approach that she had deployed walking across that ground. She had known because she knew people in the precise way that only certain kinds of solitary observers know people, from the outside, with clarity, the way you can sometimes see the structure of a building better from across the street than from inside it. This was, Marcus Webb thought, probably the same reason she kept declining the team placements. It wasn't that she didn't understand people. It was that she understood them too well to want to be surrounded by them at close range, in conditions where their individual decisions could complicate the calculation she needed to run. At a distance, she could see clearly. Up close, other people introduced variables. He wrote her a request for a meeting, sent it through the same channels he had used to pull the file. She declined, politely. On the record, with a reason that was classified above the level of his clearance, which may or may not have been genuine, and which he had absolutely no way to challenge or verify. He sat with the declined request for a while, with something he recognized as respect shading into something he wasn't immediately going to name. Then, he wrote a second request, not for a meeting, for a different kind of access. He asked to review the redacted portions of her operational record, specifically the 4 instances where she had declined team placement, specifically the language she had used. This was also declined. Different channel, different day, same outcome. He noted to himself, developing a very clear picture of how Elena Vasquez operated through the experience of trying to approach her and repeatedly being redirected, which was, of course, exactly what she was doing with him. This thought arrived in the concrete room, like the punchline to a joke he had been too slow to see coming. She was doing to him exactly what she did in the field. She was letting him define the approach vectors, move through them, and learn from the resistance. She was making him understand something through the architecture of denial rather than through explanation. He wrote a third request. This one was different in tone, less institutional, more direct, the kind of communication that acknowledges the game being played and declines to pretend otherwise. He wrote, "I'm not trying to recruit you. I'm trying to understand what you saw in that field that I didn't. That's it. You can say no to that too." He sent it. He did not wait confidently. He was a realistic person. He had now been declined twice through formal channels by someone who had made a consistent habit of declining formal channels, and the odds were not in his favor. The reply came back in 48 hours. It was a grid coordinate and a time. No name, no explanation, no operational language of any kind. Just a location and a time, which together implied agreement, and nothing else. He showed up at the grid coordinate, a coffee shop in a mid-sized European city that he was in for unrelated reasons, which was either a coincidence or evidence of a level of logistical awareness that he was choosing not to think too hard about, at the specified time, and ordered coffee, and waited. She came in 3 minutes after the specified time. Not late. She had, he understood instantly, been there before him and had left and come back, which was not paranoia, but fieldcraft, the habit of someone who checked the room before entering it, and who extended that habit to every room in every context without distinction between operational and civilian. She sat down across from him, ordered tea, looked at him with the same quality of attention he had noticed on the mountain road. Not hostile, not warm, simply present in the way that certain people are present, with their whole observational apparatus online, and nothing wasted. "Vasquez," he said. "Webb," she said. "Thank you for the meeting. You asked 3 times," she said. "Most people stop at 1. I had a reason to keep asking." "Yes," she said. "I know." They sat with this briefly. Outside the window, a European city conducted its morning in the way European cities conduct mornings, with coffee and newspapers and the specific unhurried quality that comes from living in places where the buildings are older than the countries around them, which tends to produce a certain perspective on urgency. "The field," Marcus said. "The drainage channel. You found me because the communication pattern," she said. "Your team's last contact with you was at the eastern relay point. The threat element that took out the relay was moving north-northeast based on the contact reports, which means they were moving away from the drainage infrastructure in that sector, which means if you were evading their direction of movement, you were moving toward it." She said this not as an explanation, but as a sequence, one thing following another. "You knew the terrain," he said. "I spent 48 hours in it. Before you found me, I needed to understand it before I moved through it with a liability." He absorbed the word liability without reacting, because he had not, in his 4 years of commanding a SEAL platoon, ever been described as a liability by anyone, and the precision of its application here was either insulting or honest, and he had the strong sense that with Elena Vasquez those were not the same thing. "Fair," he said. "It wasn't a judgment," she said. "I know. That's why I said fair." She looked at him differently for a half-second. Not warmly, just differently. A slight recalibration, the visual equivalent of a notation being made. "The 14 placements you declined," he said. She picked up her tea, did not drink it immediately. Held it. "You read the file," she said. "The parts 1 was cleared for. Then, you know my reasons? I know the institutional language for your reasons. I don't know your reasons." She looked out the window. A tram went past, making the particular sound that trams make, a sound that Marcus had always found unexpectedly calming despite having no rational attachment to it. "I see the problem clearly when I'm alone," she said. "When there are other people, I see them instead. Their decisions. Their fear. Their management of their fear. She paused. These are not helpful things to see when the problem requires everything. He thought about this. You're saying other people are noise. I'm saying I cannot help seeing them clearly. And seeing them clearly at close range, in those conditions, she stopped. Started again differently. I grew up understanding things from a distance. It is not a distance I can close and still be useful. This was more words than she had said in sequence since she sat down. He had the sense that it had cost something, and that the cost was not emotional but logistical, that she had been precise, and the precision had required reaching for language she didn't normally use. I'm not trying to close that distance, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said again. That's also why I came. Outside, the tram was gone. The European morning continued without them. Coffee, newspapers, buildings older than countries, the unhurried machinery of a world that had already survived a great deal and was taking its time deciding what to do next. They sat in the coffee shop for another 40 minutes. They talked about the operation and then about other operations in the careful and elusive way of people who operate in classified spaces discussing their work in unclassified rooms. They talked about the terrain of the country they were in. They talked about the mechanics of a shot she had made on her first confirmed engagement, which she described with the technical specificity of a mathematician explaining a proof, and which Marcus listened to with the focused attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him, which were rarer than he admitted. When she left, she shook his hand. Firm, brief, the handshake of someone for whom physical contact is a transactional thing, a unit of information exchanged rather than warmth communicated. He watched her walk out the door and onto the street and disappear into the morning with the same unhurried directness she brought to everything, and thought, she has been building something for a very long time, and she is the only one who knows its shape. He picked up his coffee, sat with the thought. Then he paid the bill and walked out into the European morning and went back to work, carrying with him the specific quality of changed understanding that only certain conversations produce. Not revelation, which tends to be noisy and dramatic, but revision. The quiet, structural kind, where something that was true before is still true, and something adjacent to it has been made more precise. He did not know, walking out of that coffee shop, that he and Elena Vasquez would work together 3 more times in the following 2 years. Did not know that the third time would be the one that changed both their trajectories in ways neither of them had planned for. Did not know that the file on her record, the thin edge of the larger, mostly classified thing, would eventually be the subject of a classified briefing attended by people in a building on the Potomac who would look at it with the careful and slightly uncomfortable attention of people encountering something they're not sure whether to celebrate or contain. He knew only what he had observed, that she was alone by design, precise by nature, and that the distance she maintained from the world was not damage but clarity, and that clarity in the right conditions was the most dangerous thing on the mountain. The first time they worked together after the coffee shop, it was in a coastal city in a country where the language was difficult and the politics were more difficult, and the operational window was 36 hours inside, which a network of intersecting problems had to be resolved in a specific sequence or not at all. Marcus was running the ground element. Elena was positioned on a rooftop 300 meters from the primary ingress point. She was not assigned to his element. She was there in parallel, running her own thread of the same operation, coordinating through a separate chain of command that intersected with his at exactly 2 points in the timeline, and nowhere else. They did not speak during the operation. They did not need to. She was a variable in his planning the way weather is a variable, present, accounted for, not interactive, consequential. Afterward, in the debrief, when the operation was assessed, and the outcomes were noted, and the sequencing that had made everything work was traced back through the timeline, the point where a thread and his thread had intersected. Both points, as it turned out, were where the difference between success and something else had lived. He wrote a note in the margin of his debrief copy, not a formal notation, just for himself. 2 points of contact, both decisive. She was positioned correctly both times without coordination with my element. He stared at the note. She had anticipated his movement. His team's movement. She had been in position at the moments his thread needed her without being told when those moments would arrive, because she had looked at the operational architecture and identified the load-bearing points the same way she identified them in the field from a distance, with the whole structure visible, the way certain problems only become solvable when you stop being inside them. He filed the debrief, did not annotate it. Some observations belonged to the record, and some belonged to the person making them. And this one was the second kind. The second time they worked together was 8 months later. Different country, different problem, same quality of consequence. The kind of operation that lives in the overlap between what governments authorize and what they will acknowledge, in the space where real decisions get made and real outcomes happen, and the official version is written afterward to describe a different and more comfortable sequence of events. This time, they were in closer operational proximity. Not the same element. She was still running independently, still declining team configuration at the institutional level. But the geography of the problem put them within the same grid square for approximately 6 hours at the operation's most complex point. He heard her voice on the radio once. A single transmission, a distance, a bearing, a wind reading, addressed to nobody in particular, or to the operation generally, or to the air, the kind of information that a spotter would normally transmit to a shooter, transmitted by someone who was both. Then silence. Then, 45 seconds later, the outcome the information had predicted. He had been doing this work for a long time. He had been around a great many skilled people. He had the specific and carefully calibrated respect for competence that develops in people who work in environments where incompetence gets people killed, which is a respect that burns away everything sentimental and leaves only the clear assessment of what a person can do and how reliably they can do it under conditions that are not ideal. He had never heard a single radio transmission carry that much information in that small a package, deployed with that exact precision of timing. He thought about this later, in the debrief, in the quiet afterward on the flight home. He thought about the 9 years she had spent building toward the capacity to do what she did. 9 years of ranges and operations and terrain and calculations of declining the team placements of operating from that specific position outside and above and slightly removed that gave her the angle of vision she had. He thought about the cornfield in Texas, which he knew about from the file. Not the details, but the outline, a grandfather, a fence post, a 9-year-old who had discovered something about herself that she spent the next 26 years rendering into its fullest form. He thought about the way she had described it in the coffee shop. I see the problem clearly when I'm alone. He understood this differently now, not as a social limitation, a personality quirk, a trauma response, an interpersonal difficulty dressed up in operational language, as a precision instrument, as the thing that made the rest of it possible. The distance was not a wall she had built to keep the world out. It was the calibrated remove of someone who had learned slowly and through enormous practice that clarity is not free and that its cost is proximity. You could be close to things, or you could see them clearly. Elena Vasquez had chosen 9 years ago on a fence post in Texas, and every day since to see clearly. The third time they worked together was in the spring of the following year, in a mountainous border region where the political situation had been deteriorating for 7 months, and the military situation had been deteriorating faster, in a way that military situations in mountainous border regions tend to deteriorate, not catastrophically and all at once, but through the slow accumulation of incidents, each of which is manageable in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. Marcus was there with a 4-man element, running what was officially a training advisor capacity and was functionally a great deal more than that. Elena was there independently. She was always officially there independently. On the third day, the situation changed in the way that situations change in those regions. Without announcement, with the complete indifference to operational timelines that makes planning simultaneously essential and inadequate. Marcus's element was in the wrong position when it changed. Not wrong through negligence or poor planning. Wrong because the change had come from an unexpected direction, exploiting a gap in the threat assessment that nobody had correctly identified, and the gap was the kind that only becomes visible in retrospect, which is the only kind of retrospect available in those situations. They were compromised. Communication to the rear was degraded. The extraction timeline had become a theoretical document describing a set of conditions that no longer existed. He made his assessments in the order that matters. Personnel, position, options. Personnel, for people, no casualties yet, 1 man with a knee that had been aggravated in the movement and was now a liability in the mobility column. Position, a building partially structurally sound, with sight lines that were acceptable to the north and east and unacceptable to the south, which was the direction the threat pattern was currently running. Options, wait for the threat to move and create an extraction window or create the extraction window, or have someone create it for them. The third option required something he did not have in the building. He put out a position report on the degraded channel, using the brevity codes that reduced a complex situation to 9 numbers that anyone in the network could decode, and he transmitted it knowing that what came back would tell him whether the option existed. 8 minutes later, his radio transmitted a single number, a distance. He recognized the transmission format. He had heard it once before, 45 seconds before an outcome that had changed the course of an operation. She was 340 meters to his north. She had already identified the problem, already positioned for it. He did not know if she had been in the area when his situation changed, or if she had moved to the area afterward, and he understood, thinking about it, that this distinction was not really meaningful, because either way she had seen the problem clearly and moved to the position the problem required, which was the only relevant fact. He transmitted a bearing and a timing window. She transmitted back, understood. What happened next lasted 22 minutes by his watch, though it had the quality of time that certain high-consequence situations have, stretched and compressed simultaneously, every second containing more information than seconds ordinarily contain, the nervous system running hotter than its engineering intends, filtering and filtering and filtering. She worked the southern sight lines from her position with the methodical and unhurried precision that Marcus had come to associate with her. Not because the situation was not urgent, it was extremely urgent, but because urgency for Elena Vasquez was not something that lived in her movements. It lived in her preparation. By the time urgency arrived, she had already been urgent weeks ago at a range somewhere in a calculation she had run until it was automatic. In the moment itself, she was calm. Not the false calm of someone suppressing panic. The genuine article. The calm of a person doing a thing they have done 10,000 times, in conditions that are worse than the range but better than some of the other conditions they have worked in, using equipment they know completely through a methodology they could teach in their sleep. In 22 minutes, Marcus's element had a viable southern route. They took it. They moved to the secondary extraction point and waited for the window, and the window came, and they were out before the threat pattern had fully processed what had happened. In the debrief, a better room this time, better coffee. Marcus went through the sequence, and when he got to the 22 minutes, the analyst running the debrief looked up from his notes and said, "The support asset," Vasquez. Marcus said, "The support asset's position when she engaged the southern problem, she would have been visible from 3 separate elevated positions that were threat-occupied at that time." Marcus said nothing. "That means she was engaged while working the problem," the analyst said. He said in the flat voice of someone who is not sure whether they're describing heroism or recklessness and is waiting for context. "She was," Marcus said, "and she continued the engagement anyway." "She did." The analyst looked at his notes, made a notation. "Look back up. Did she take any?" "She was not hit," Marcus said. He knew this because he had confirmed it before the debrief. He had made a specific and slightly unusual request through channels. Not a formal welfare check. Nothing that would generate the kind of paperwork that attracted attention. Just a confirmation from a person he trusted at a level 3 tiers up from his own that Vasquez was fine. She was fine. She had been visible from 3 threat-occupied elevated positions while working a precision engagement problem, and she was fine, and this was either very good fortune or the specific absence of very bad fortune. And Marcus was honest enough with himself to know that the line between those two things was real, but narrow. He sat with this in the debrief, and then after the debrief, and then on the flight back, and then in the weeks afterward when the operation had been written up and filed and classified, and he was doing other things in other places, and the thought followed him in the way that certain thoughts follow certain people. Not loudly, not constantly, but reliably. Always there when he was quiet enough to hear it. She had been visible from 3 threat-occupied positions. She had continued anyway. Not because she hadn't assessed the risk. Elena Vasquez assessed everything continuously, with the reflex of someone whose survival had been purchased with the currency of accurate assessment. She had assessed it. She had seen the risk clearly from her characteristic distance, and she had made the decision that the problem required her to continue, and so she continued. This was the thing Marcus understood now, that nobody in the debrief rooms and the assessment files and the institutional acknowledgments had ever quite managed to name. The thing that the language of operational excellence and precision fires and exceptional tactical performance circled around without landing on. It was not that she was fearless. Fearless people were dangerous in a different and more chaotic direction. They were the ones who got other people killed, who misread situations because they lacked the self-preservation instinct that correctly calibrated risk. She was not fearless. She had assessed the risk completely and chosen to continue anyway because the problem required it. Not heroism. Decision. The specific and deliberate decision of someone who has looked at a situation clearly and decided that the cost of continuing is the right cost to pay. This was, Marcus thought, a different thing from bravery the way precision was a different thing from accuracy. Adjacent, but not the same, and the difference between them was everything. He requested a meeting. She accepted immediately this time. No delay, no declined request. One grid coordinate, one time, same format as before. They met in a different city, different coffee shop. She was there before him again. He had expected this, had not tried to arrive earlier because the point was not to beat her to it, but to understand it. And when he came through the door, she was sitting with tea she had already ordered, and the same quality of settled, undivided attention she brought everywhere. He sat down. "You were visible," he said. She nodded. "From 3 positions. 2 with clear sight lines," she said. "The third had an obstruction at the relevant angle. I had approximately 40 seconds before it moved into a useful position." He looked at her. "You were counting." "I was always counting," she said. He sat with this. "You chose to continue," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite amusement, but something that lived between them. "Because stopping would have meant you didn't get your 22 minutes. And I've been doing this for 9 years, she said. "I've been visible from compromised positions before. I have a methodology. The methodology holds." The methodology held this time. "Yes. What if it doesn't hold sometime?" She looked at him directly with the clear and undeflected gaze of someone who has had this conversation with themselves many times and arrived at an answer they're genuinely comfortable with. Then it doesn't hold. And the operation was worth it or it wasn't. And the person who made the decision to continue is not available to have a view about the outcome. He was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this," he said. "Extensively. And I'm comfortable with it," she said. "Don't." He stopped. She had read the direction of what he was going to say before he said it. The question about whether she was all right, whether the solo work was sustainable, whether what she was doing was something that a person could continue indefinitely. And she had said, don't in a tone that was not rude, but was absolutely final. He respected it. He closed that line of inquiry without resentment. "What I want to ask you," he said, "is different." She waited. "Not about whether you're all right," he said. "About what you know. About what you see from that distance that people inside the problem can't see." She was still. "I've been in the field with you 3 times now," he said, "or adjacent to it. Each time, you were in the right position before the situation required it. Not reacting. Anticipating. The drainage channel. The coastal operation. The southern sector 3 weeks ago. You saw where the problem was going to be." He leaned forward slightly. "I want to understand that. Not to replicate it. I don't think it's replicable. But to understand what you're looking at when you see it." She considered this for a long time. Long enough that the silence became something with texture, something she was working in rather than leaving empty. "The load-bearing points," she said finally. "Every operation has a structure. Like a building. Most of the structure is redundant. It holds, but it's not critical. There are 2, maybe 3 points that are actually critical, where if they fail, the whole thing fails. Most people are inside the building. They can't see the structure. You're outside it," Marcus said. "I'm always outside it," she said. She said it without apology, without self-consciousness, as a simple description of a fact she had spent 9 years confirming. "I grew up outside things," she said. "People. Noise. The way other people experience the world. I used to think it was a deficiency." She paused. "My grandfather showed me it wasn't. He didn't explain it. He just handed me a rifle and stepped back." She stopped, picked up her tea. "Distance is not damage," she said. "It is a position. And from that position, I can see clearly." Marcus Webb sat in that coffee shop in a city where the buildings were older than the governments they had sheltered, and he listened to the most singular person he had ever encountered in 20 years of doing a job that specialized in singular people describe. Without drama, without grief, without any of the ornamentation that lesser stories attached to their central truths, what she was and how she had become it. He did not ask her to be anything different. Did not ask her to close the distance she had spent her life calibrating. He said, "The operation next month in the northern sector. There's a problem I can't see from inside it. She looked at him. I know, she said. You've already looked at it. I looked at it 3 days ago. He nodded. He realized, expected this. He had sent her the grid coordinates and the operational timeline through a channel that was technically not the right channel, technically not a coordination request, technically just an information share. And she had received it and looked at it and identified the problem, and she had been waiting with the patience of someone who is never in a hurry, because hurry is what happens when you're inside the problem, for him to ask the question she had already answered. Tell me what you see, he said. She told him. It took 28 minutes. She used no notes, no maps, nothing except the contents of a preparation that had been running since 3 days ago, drawn from a memory that functioned like a filed system where nothing was ever lost, only organized differently depending on what the current problem required. He listened, and as he listened, he understood that the thing she was describing, the structure of the problem, the load-bearing points, the positions that the operation would need to occupy before it needed them, was not strategic analysis, not intelligence assessment, not any of the formal disciplines the institutions have vocabularies for. It was the thing she had been doing since she was 9 years old. She was seeing clearly, from a distance. And that distance, that particular and earned and costly distance from which the world arranged itself into structures instead of noise, was the thing she had to offer that no institution and no training pipeline and no official program had ever quite managed to produce in anyone else. He walked out of the coffee shop into the afternoon of a city that was older than its governments, with the operational problem of the northern sector considerably more solvable than it had been 2 hours ago, and with the slower-moving, more structural understanding that some people are made for the margins, not the margins of the world, but the margins of the crowd, the edges where the view is longest and clearest, and where the people with the patience to stand there can see things the middle can't. Elena Vasquez had always been at the edge. Everything she had done, the rifle, the ranges, the 9 years, the 4 decline placements, the drainage channel, the 22 minutes, the visible positions, and the methodology that held, had been in service of staying there, at the edge, where she could see,